It was a time when survival was already hard enough, when life was ruled not by fairness or compassion, but by tradition, superstition, and fear. The streets of medieval Europe were narrow, filthy, and lined with timber houses that leaned so close together their rooftops nearly touched. The church bells tolled at dawn and dusk, reminding everyone that God, sin, and judgment were never far from their minds. For most people, every action was watched, not just by neighbors, but by priests, magistrates, and councils of men who claimed authority over how others lived. And for women especially, the rules of society were sharp-edged, unforgiving, and often cruel. History remembers wars, kings, and castles, but hidden in its shadow are the lives of countless women who faced punishments that today sound almost unreal. Punishments that weren't just about law and order, but about shame, control, and the constant reminder of their place in a world designed to silence them. These punishments were not only physical, but deeply psychological. They were designed to humiliate, to mark women as examples, to make them warnings for everyone else who might think of stepping out of line. And the strangest part? Many of these punishments were treated as public spectacles, like entertainment. Ordinary villagers would gather to watch, whisper, laugh, or sometimes pity, yet no one dared interfere. Imagine standing in a crowded marketplace, the smell of bread and smoke heavy in the air, as a woman is brought forward by guards. She has not stolen gold, nor harmed anyone, but perhaps she raised her voice too often or gossiped too loudly, or argued with her husband in a way that was deemed disrespectful. The punishment? A device called the scold's bridle, an iron mask with a metal bit that was forced into her mouth to stop her from speaking. She would be paraded through the town, unable to utter a sound, while everyone stared. To us today, it seems unimaginable, but in medieval Europe, this was considered justice. And that is only the beginning. Across different kingdoms, from England to France, Germany to Spain, women faced punishments so strange they sound like dark fables. Some were dunked into freezing rivers in tests of purity. Some were chained in public squares as their sins were shouted aloud. Others had to wear heavy collars of iron or walk barefoot through streets lined with mockers. At times, the punishments were almost theatrical, meant to humiliate more than harm, but the scars they left, on body and spirit, were lasting. These were not punishments reserved for terrible crimes. No, many of these bizarre practices targeted ordinary women, accused of being quarrelsome, disobedient, or simply unlucky enough to become the subject of rumor. To modern ears, it feels unjust, even absurd. But to the people of the time, it was part of maintaining order in a world where women were often seen as temptations, distractions, or problems to be controlled. One of the most chilling parts of this history is how public it all was. Today, punishment is hidden away in prisons or courtrooms. But in the medieval world, it was performed openly, with townspeople invited to witness and learn. A woman wearing a shaming collar was not only being punished herself, she was being made into a living lesson for every other woman who passed by. The spectacle was part of the sentence. It was about fear, reputation, and control. But who were these women? They weren't queens or noble ladies in tall towers. More often, they were villagers, wives, daughters, and mothers. Ordinary people whose names history rarely bothered to record. And yet, through these punishments, their lives echo forward to us across centuries, reminding us of just how fragile freedom once was, and how easily cruelty could be disguised as justice. The punishments themselves reveal something about the times. They show us not just what was considered a crime, but what society feared most. Gossip, disobedience, accusations of witchcraft, even laughter at the wrong moment could land a woman in trouble. The bizarre devices, the humiliating rituals, the community shaming, all of it paints a picture of a world obsessed with order, reputation, and silence. Picture this: a wooden stool by the riverbank, ropes creaking as a woman is strapped in. Villagers crowd around, their faces a mix of curiosity and judgment. The sentence is ducking, a punishment for so-called scolds or nagging wives. With jeers from the crowd, the stool tips forward, plunging her into the icy water. She surfaces, coughing, only to be dumped again. It wasn't meant to kill, though sometimes it did. It was meant to humiliate, to frighten, to remind her, and everyone watching, that speaking too loudly or challenging too strongly could lead to this. It's easy to think of these practices as belonging to a distant, barbaric past, but they reveal patterns that stretch across history. Societies creating punishments not just to stop crime, but to enforce control, often at the expense of women. The instruments of punishment may have changed, but the echoes remain. As we journey deeper into this story, we will uncover the strangest, most unsettling punishments that women endured, not only in medieval Europe, but in other corners of the world too. From cages that dangled in the air to humiliating masks that forced silence. From parades of shame to trials by ordeal, each punishment tells a story of fear, power, and survival. These were more than punishments. They were performances meant to shape society itself. And yet, in the middle of this darkness, there is something else, something that history often overlooks. There were women who resisted, who endured, who found ways to survive and even laugh in the face of humiliation. There were whispers of rebellion, moments of solidarity, and small acts of defiance that remind us these women were never just victims. They were human beings with courage, spirit, and stories worth remembering. The deeper we look, the more unsettling it becomes. What does it say about a society that could take something as ordinary as a raised voice and turn it into a public crime? What does it say about a culture where punishment became theater, where suffering became a lesson for others? And most of all, what does it say about how fragile justice can be when power is unchecked? The answers are not simple, and they unfold like a shadowed tapestry. As we explore the bizarre punishments of women in medieval Europe and beyond, we are not just looking at the past. We are looking into a mirror that reflects questions about humanity, power, and the way societies shape themselves through fear. But before we reveal the most shocking and unbelievable punishments, before we uncover the stories that will make you wonder how such things could have ever been real, there is one more truth to face. Many of these punishments did not simply disappear when the medieval age ended. Some transformed, some lingered in different forms, and some traveled across oceans into new societies, reappearing in ways both strange and familiar. And so, the journey we are about to take is not just a tour of the bizarre. It is a journey into the heart of how human beings have tried, again and again, to control one another, and how, in the end, the spirit of resistance has always found a way to endure. But the strangest punishment of all, the one that still shocks historians today, was so bizarre, so humiliating, and so cruel that even among the harsh customs of its time, it stood out. And when we reach that moment, you will see just how far society was willing to go to silence a single voice. The question is, whose voice was it, and why was it considered so dangerous? The marketplace is crowded, the air thick with smoke from torches and the noise of merchants shouting over one another. Somewhere in the middle of it all, a group of guards makes its way through the narrow street, pushing back villagers who are eager to catch a glimpse of the day's spectacle. At the center is a woman, her hands bound, her face pale but defiant. She has been accused of disturbing the peace by arguing too loudly with her neighbor. Today, her punishment is not a fine, not even a night in the stocks. It is the scold's bridle, a heavy iron contraption shaped like a cage that fits over her head, clamping down until a sharp piece of metal rests against her tongue. The crowd murmurs, some with pity, others with satisfaction. For them, this is more than punishment. It is entertainment. Children climb on barrels to see better. Men nudge one another with cruel smiles, and women shake their heads, whispering warnings to their daughters. The guards force the bridle onto her, locking it with a loud clang. Her jaw is pressed shut, her voice taken from her. She can no longer argue, no longer shout, no longer protest. And then she is led through the streets, a living warning to every woman who dares to speak too freely. The bridle is so heavy she stumbles, yet she refuses to cry. Her silence is not surrender, it is defiance. But few will remember her that way. To most, she will simply be the scold, the lesson. This punishment may sound grotesque, almost unbelievable, but it was real. Across medieval Europe, women labeled as troublesome were subjected to it. The idea was simple: silence the tongue, silence the problem. It was not about justice, it was about control. And it reminds us of how deeply fear of women's voices shaped the world of the Middle Ages. But the scold's bridle was only one of many bizarre tools of punishment. Another was the ducking stool, a device as cruel as it was theatrical. Imagine a wooden chair fastened to the end of a long beam. A woman, accused of being quarrelsome or disobedient, would be tied to the chair. Before a cheering crowd, she was swung out over a pond or river and dunked into the freezing water again and again. Each plunge was met with laughter, jeers, and shouts from onlookers. Some women nearly drowned. Others caught illnesses that lasted long after. And all of it was framed not as brutality, but as teaching a lesson. The strange thing is how ritualized these punishments became. They were not carried out in the shadows. They were staged in the very heart of town. Punishment was performance. The humiliation of one woman became a public play in which everyone had a part to act. The guards as enforcers, the magistrates as judges, the crowd as audience, and the woman herself as unwilling star. These performances etched lessons into the minds of villagers, lessons about obedience, about silence, about knowing one's place. And yet, beneath all the noise and spectacle, there were quiet moments of resistance. Some women spat into the faces of their accusers before being gagged. Some laughed, even as the ducking stool plunged them into icy waters, mocking the crowd with every gasp for breath. Others whispered to their daughters in the crowd, telling them to remember, to never forget what had been done. These acts may seem small, but in a world that thrived on fear, they were powerful. Beyond England and France, other regions had their own bizarre punishments. In parts of Germany, women who broke social codes might be forced to wear heavy iron collars, sometimes with bells attached, so their shame rang out with every step. In Italy, accusations of immorality could result in a public shaving of the head, stripping a woman not only of her hair, but of her dignity in a culture where beauty was tied to honor. Each culture had its own rituals, but the goal was always the same: control through humiliation. The deeper you look into this history, the more unsettling it becomes. These punishments weren't simply about maintaining law. They reveal a society terrified of disorder, terrified of rebellion, and especially terrified of women who didn't fit neatly into the roles assigned to them. A raised voice, a sharp tongue, a refusal to remain silent. These were not minor annoyances to the men in power. They were threats, and threats, in a world built on fragile hierarchies, had to be crushed in ways that everyone could see. But the cruelest punishments were often tied to the most dangerous accusations of all: accusations of witchcraft. The medieval obsession with witches brought forth punishments that blurred the line between justice and superstition, between law and fear. Women suspected of casting spells or cursing neighbors were subjected to trials that sound almost surreal. One of the most infamous was the ordeal by water. A woman accused of witchcraft would be bound and lowered into a river or pond. If she floated, it was taken as proof that the water, seen as pure, rejected her, marking her as guilty. If she sank, she was considered innocent, though many drowned before they could be pulled out. The crowd would watch in breathless silence as the woman thrashed in the water, her fate decided not by evidence or reason, but by superstition and fear. It is easy to wonder why entire communities accepted such bizarre practices. Why did no one stand up and say, "This is madness"? The truth is, fear silenced them. In societies where crops could fail, plagues could spread, and war could erupt without warning, people looked for someone to blame. Women who stood out, too outspoken, too independent, too different, became easy targets. And once the accusation was made, the punishment was inevitable. But behind every punishment was a story, a woman with a name, a family, a life that mattered. History rarely recorded those details, but if you close your eyes, you can imagine them. A mother clutching her child one last time before being led to the ducking stool. A daughter watching her mother paraded through the streets with an iron bridle, vowing never to forget. A young woman, accused of witchcraft, praying desperately as the rope tightened around her wrists before the ordeal by water began. These are the human moments that history books often leave out, yet they are the heart of the story. And so, as we move deeper into this world of bizarre punishments, we are not just uncovering odd curiosities of the past. We are walking into the lives of real people, women who lived, suffered, resisted, and endured. Their stories remind us of the cost of fear, the dangers of unchecked power, and the resilience of the human spirit. But the question still lingers: what was the most bizarre punishment of them all? What punishment was so strange, so cruel, that even centuries later it shocks us? The answer lies ahead, in a tale that will test the limits of imagination. A punishment so humiliating that even those who carried it out whispered about it in private. And when you hear it, you may wonder, was it really meant to correct, or was it simply meant to break? Night falls over a medieval town, but the punishments do not always wait for daylight. The sound of iron chains rattling in the streets could echo even in the dark. Lanterns flicker as villagers peek through shutters, whispering to each other about the woman being dragged through the square. She has not stolen, murdered, or betrayed her king. Her crime is different, almost laughable by modern standards. She gossiped too much. But in the eyes of the council, gossip is dangerous. Words spread faster than disease. They can topple reputations, stir resentment, and undermine authority. And so, her punishment is as public as her crime. She is forced to wear a gossip's bridle, a heavy iron mask with grotesque features, exaggerated lips, and tongue carved into the metal, mocking the very voice she was accused of abusing. The villagers watch her shuffle forward, her shame magnified not just by the device itself, but by the laughter of those around her. It seems bizarre that something as small as gossip could inspire such elaborate cruelty. But this was the nature of medieval justice. To silence a woman was to protect the order of the town. To humiliate her was to remind others that words, though invisible, could destroy lives. The punishment becomes a story, repeated to children and neighbors, until the lesson takes root. Beware of your tongue, or it might be caged. But it wasn't only words that could bring punishment. In some villages, women accused of laziness or neglect were chained by the ankles and forced to sweep the streets while wearing humiliating signs that read idle or slothful. It wasn't about cleaning the streets, it was about scrubbing away reputation. The women were put on display as failures, their private struggles turned into public theater. Elsewhere, punishments could be even stranger. In parts of Central Europe, women suspected of being unfaithful were paraded on donkeys, facing backward with mocking crowns of straw on their heads. The backward seating symbolized the wrongness of their choices, the donkey emphasizing ridicule. The crowd jeered as they passed, laughing at the humiliation. To those who watched, it was justice. To the women themselves, it was a tearing away of dignity, leaving scars deeper than any physical wound. The theater of punishment often relied on the crowd as much as the punishment itself. A woman locked in stocks might sit for hours while villagers hurled insults, spoiled food, or worse at her. The punishment did not end when the guards left. It continued with every cruel word, every mocking laugh. The crowd was part of the sentence, enlisted as both witness and enforcer. In this way, punishment became a shared ritual of society, binding people together in fear and control. And yet, not all spectators agreed. Imagine standing in the crowd, watching a neighbor or friend endure such humiliation. Imagine the conflict, fear of speaking out clashing with the urge to show compassion. There are stories of women who try to slip bread or water to those in the stocks, only to be scolded or threaten themselves. Acts of kindness were dangerous, but they existed, flickering like small flames in a dark world. Punishments were not always physical devices or public humiliations. Sometimes they took the form of ordeals, tests believed to reveal truth through suffering. One of the strangest was the ordeal of hot iron. A woman accused of lying might be forced to carry a piece of red-hot metal a short distance. If her wounds healed cleanly, she was considered innocent. If they festered, guilt was assumed. It sounds absurd to us, but to those in power, the ordeal was a way of handing judgment over to God. Of course, the wounds nearly always festered, and the punishment became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Another bizarre ordeal involved bread and cheese. In certain regions, a woman suspected of dishonesty would be made to swallow a piece of dry bread and cheese while reciting prayers. If she choked, she was guilty. If she swallowed, she was innocent. A life could hinge on a cough, on a moment of nerves in front of a hostile crowd. What ties all of these punishments together is not their strangeness alone, but their purpose. They were not designed to correct crime in the way we think of justice today. They were designed to maintain order by fear, to make examples of people, to turn private behavior into public cautionary tales. Women in particular were easy targets because society already saw them as weaker, more suspicious, more likely to fall into sin. By punishing them publicly, the authorities reinforced those beliefs. But perhaps the most unsettling punishments were those that blurred the line between punishment and ritual humiliation. In England, a woman convicted of being a common scold might be tied to a cart and dragged through town, jeered at by children and adults alike. The dragging itself was not always violent, but the spectacle left her marked forever. Everyone knew, everyone remembered, and reputation, in the medieval world, was often more important than freedom itself. Imagine what it must have felt like to be the center of the crowd's gaze, to feel eyes on your back, laughter in your ears, and shame pressed down like a weight heavier than iron. Punishment ended in hours or days, but the whispers lasted a lifetime. The bizarre punishments of women in medieval Europe were not simply about justice. They were about memory. They were designed to be unforgettable, so that the lesson would live on long after the iron was removed, the stocks dismantled, the stool pulled from the river. And yet, as cruel as these punishments sound, they were not considered extraordinary at the time. They were woven into the very fabric of life. Markets had stalls for bread, cloth, and tools, and often a set of stocks nearby. Rivers provided water for fishing and washing, and for dunking stools as well. The instruments of punishment were as much a part of the town as the church and the marketplace. This ordinariness is what makes the story so haunting. For the people of that time, bizarre punishments were not bizarre at all. They were normal. They were expected. They were accepted as part of the rhythm of life. And that acceptance raises uncomfortable questions. How could cruelty become ordinary? How could laughter echo over suffering without anyone stepping forward to stop it? The answers are buried in the fears and structures of the time. Fear of disorder, fear of women's voices, fear of change. To punish publicly was to protect stability, or at least that is what people told themselves. But as we peel back the layers of history, it becomes harder to accept that explanation. Was it really about stability, or was it about power? And if it was about power, who was really being protected? The strangest punishment of all, the one that lingers in the shadows of history like a dark secret, may hold the key. It was not about gossip or disobedience or witchcraft. It was something more, something that reached into the very heart of how society defined women themselves. And when we uncover it, you may wonder whether it was punishment at all, or simply cruelty for cruelty's sake. Morning light spills across the cobblestones, and the town square slowly fills with villagers. Merchants set up their stalls, bakers pull steaming loaves from their ovens, and farmers drive their carts of hay and vegetables into place. But today there is a different kind of excitement. Word has spread that a punishment is to take place. A woman will be brought forward for her supposed crimes. She is not a thief or a murderer. Her only mistake was quarreling with her husband, loudly enough that the neighbors heard. In a world where a woman's duty was obedience and silence, Even an argument could be judged as rebellion. And rebellion, no matter how small, demanded spectacle. The crowd gathers as she is tied to a wooden frame, her body bound but her face left exposed. Then the executioner, more showman than punisher, places around her neck a massive iron collar. The collar is engraved with cruel words: nag, shrew, disobedient. Bells hang from its edges so that every step she takes rings with shame. The villagers point and laugh as she is led through the streets, each jingle of the bells a reminder of her humiliation. For hours she walks, her back straight, her eyes staring at the ground. Children chase behind, mocking her, while adults whisper to one another. When the walk is over, the collar is removed, but the shame remains. The bells have done their work. Everyone in town will remember the sound, and the woman will be branded in memory long after the iron has left her skin. It is punishments like these that reveal the strange cruelty of the medieval world. They were not designed to wound flesh, though many did. They were designed to wound reputation, to turn a person into a living warning. For women, the risk of such punishment was constant. Any step outside the narrow line of obedience could bring judgment. And judgment, in that world, rarely came in whispers. It came in iron and wood, in water and fire, in spectacle and shame. Consider, too, the cucking stool. Similar to the ducking stool, but used in different ways, it was a wooden seat placed in public spaces. A woman accused of gossip or disobedience would be strapped to it, left for hours as villagers passed by. Unlike the stocks, which trapped the body, the stool placed her on display. Perched like a bird, visible from all sides, her shame magnified by the mocking laughter of those who walked past. Some were even forced to wear mocking hats, painted in bright colors or shaped like donkey ears, as symbols of foolishness. Imagine the helplessness of sitting there, unable to move, unable to shield yourself from the gaze of hundreds of eyes. The punishment was simple, yet devastating. The body could heal from iron, but reputation, once torn apart, rarely mended. Not all punishments were this public. Some were carried out behind closed doors, whispered about afterward, but never seen. In certain regions, women suspected of witchcraft or disobedience were locked in tiny iron cages, barely large enough to sit inside. They were left there for hours, sometimes days, their cramped limbs aching, their voices hoarse from crying. The cage itself was not just a prison. It was a symbol. It told the world that this woman was dangerous, an animal to be contained, a threat to be displayed. One traveler from the 15th century described seeing such a cage hanging from a town gate, the woman inside forced to endure the stares of every passerby. Her only crime? Being accused of speaking curses during a storm. Whether she had or not didn't matter. The punishment had already decided the truth. There were also strange, symbolic punishments, designed not to harm, but to humiliate. In some towns, women accused of infidelity were forced to wear clothes inside out or backwards, marching through the streets while crowds shouted. Others had to carry heavy stones through the marketplace, the weight symbolizing the burden of their supposed sin. Still others were forced to kneel in front of the church doors, holding candles as villagers filed past them, shaking their heads. These rituals were as much about theater as justice. They transformed mistakes, real or imagined, into cautionary tales for the whole community. And yet, through all these punishments, there were glimmers of humanity. Some villagers looked on with pity, not laughter. Some whispered prayers under their breath for the women who suffered. Some even tried to intervene, though rarely with success. History often records the cruelty, but between the lines we can sense something else, a quiet resistance, a refusal to fully accept that humiliation was justice. As centuries passed, punishments grew more elaborate, shaped not only by law but by superstition. Women accused of bringing misfortune, spoiling milk, cursing crops, or causing illness, were dragged into strange rituals meant to prove their guilt. In one account, a woman was forced to walk barefoot across glowing embers, her innocence judged by whether her feet blistered. In another, she was weighed against a massive Bible, If she was lighter, it meant the devil had helped her. These trials, though bizarre, were deadly serious. They reflected a world desperate for certainty, clinging to rituals that today seem almost absurd. But here lies the deepest truth. These punishments, as cruel and strange as they sound, were not only about women. They were about power. They were about a world in which those who ruled, whether priests, magistrates, or husbands, feared losing control. By making punishment a spectacle, they reinforced their authority. By humiliating one woman, they warned every other woman. And by calling it justice, they disguised fear as order. Still, one cannot help but wonder about the women themselves. What went through their minds as the iron mask clamped shut, as the ducking stool plunged, as the bells of the collar rang in their ears? Did they feel shame, fury, or perhaps a quiet, unbroken strength? History rarely tells us, but sometimes, in fragments of letters or notes scribbled by witnesses, we glimpse defiance. A woman who laughed at her tormentors. A mother who locked eyes with her daughter in the crowd, silently passing on courage. A widow who, after her punishment ended, lived on as fiercely as before, refusing to be broken. These stories remind us that even in the darkest times, humanity finds ways to endure. But they also remind us how fragile freedom can be. What was ordinary then would be unthinkable now. Yet it happened, not once, but countless times across towns and villages across centuries. And the strangest punishment of all, the one whispered about in chronicles and hinted at in court records, remains ahead. It was not simply iron or wood, not merely shame or spectacle. It was something so peculiar, so deeply unsettling, that even today historians debate why it existed at all. The question we must ask is simple. What punishment could be so bizarre that even in a world of cages, collars, and ducking stools, it still stood apart? The answer lies in a story that begins with a woman dragged into the square at dawn, her eyes covered, her voice trembling as the crowd gathered in silence. Not laughter, not jeers, but silence. A punishment unlike any they had seen before was about to begin. The wind carried the smell of smoke and damp earth, as if the land itself remembered what people often tried to forget. In small towns across medieval Europe, the walls of stone churches and wooden market stalls had silently witnessed countless lives being judged, punished, or broken apart in the name of law and order. People whispered of bizarre punishments that seemed more about spectacle than justice. And yet, for those who lived through them, the memory never faded. A punishment was not just a sentence. It was a mark carried through generations. Families were changed, reputations destroyed, and lives bent under the weight of shame. Women, more often than not, bore the heaviest share of this strange justice system, where appearances mattered as much as truth. The strange part was that not all of these punishments were brutal in the way one might first imagine. Many were humiliating, theatrical, and designed to make sure the accused never escaped the gaze of their neighbors again. That was the real power of these punishments. They were not meant to be forgotten. Imagine a crowded marketplace on a Saturday afternoon. Merchants are shouting, children are running about, and people gather to trade stories as much as goods. Suddenly, the sound of a bell echoes through the square. Heads turn, conversations stop, and people know instantly what is about to happen. Someone is being brought forward, accused of stepping outside the rules that define their community. The punishment is not hidden behind prison walls. It is performed in front of everyone. That is where the power lies, turning justice into theater. This world was bound by honor, reputation, and community standing. For women especially, their entire lives could hinge on a single moment of public shame. If a woman was accused of gossiping too much, of being unfaithful, or even of speaking out of turn, the weight of punishment could come crashing down. Some were forced into bizarre contraptions, devices created to silence or mock them. Others were paraded through the streets, their dignity stripped away while their neighbors watched. It was not always about what someone had done, but about making an example of them so that everyone else learned the same lesson. Never cross the invisible lines drawn by tradition church, and authority. Behind these punishments lay a system of beliefs as strange as they were powerful. People of that era believed the world was filled with invisible forces, God's will, the devil's temptation, the unseen balance of sin and virtue. To them, punishment was not just about correcting someone's behavior. It was about restoring balance to the community. If someone broke the rules, it was as if the entire town or village was put at risk. Allowing sin to go unpunished could mean inviting famine, disease, or divine anger. That was the fear that drove ordinary people to gather in crowds, not only to watch, but sometimes to cheer when punishments were carried out. They believed they were protecting themselves by making sure others paid the price. But beneath all of this, something darker was at play. Power was not evenly shared. Men held authority in government, in church, and in family life, and this imbalance shaped the way justice was applied. While men were punished for crimes like theft or violence, women often faced penalties tied directly to their behavior, their speech, or even their presence in society. Being outspoken, independent, or different could all be seen as dangerous. In many cases, it was not the act itself that was punished, but the challenge it represented to the established order. That is why the punishments of women in medieval Europe often seem so bizarre today. They were less about crime and more about control. Picture, for instance, a woman accused of spreading rumors in a town where gossip was believed to destroy trust and fuel conflict. She might be forced to wear a heavy iron mask that covered her mouth, sometimes with spikes that pressed against her tongue if she tried to speak. The punishment was not only painful, but humiliating. Everyone who saw her would know exactly what crime she had been accused of. Neighbors would whisper, children would laugh, and her silence would become part of the show. For her, the punishment did not end when the mask was taken off. The memory, the shame, the looks from others would follow her for years, perhaps even forever. Or think of the woman dragged to a public square to be fastened into a wooden device where she was forced to sit for hours, sometimes days, while villagers jeered. These bizarre punishments were not designed to teach lessons quietly. They were meant to echo through every household. Stories of them spread far beyond the towns where they happened. They became cautionary tales passed down from mother to daughter, warnings about what could happen if one dared to cross the lines drawn by men in power. It is easy now to look back and wonder why people allowed such punishments to happen, why they did not resist. But for those living then, the world felt fragile. Disease could sweep through a town without warning. Crops could fail. Wars could erupt. Life was unpredictable, and punishment seemed like a way of holding on to order in the chaos. In such a world, to be different was to be dangerous, and so bizarre punishments were accepted as part of survival. Still, not everyone agreed. Even in the Middle Ages, voices quietly rose against these practices. Some clergy, some townsfolk, and even some officials questioned whether humiliation or cruelty truly served justice. Their words often went unheard, buried under fear and tradition. But they remind us that history is never one-sided. There are always those who saw the injustice and longed for change. As centuries passed, many of these punishments disappeared, replaced by prisons or fines. But their stories remain, carved into records and whispered in legends. The bizarre punishments of medieval women are more than curiosities. They are windows into a world where control, fear, and spectacle shaped the lives of ordinary people. They force us to ask uncomfortable questions about how societies decide who is punished, how, and why. And perhaps most haunting of all is the realization that behind every tale of a strange punishment lies a real person, a woman with a family, with hopes and fears, who is forced to endure the unbearable weight of public shame. Yet the story is not complete. For every bizarre punishment recorded, there are others that were hidden, forgotten, or erased. The written accounts we have today were often created by those in power, monks, judges, or wealthy officials. Their records tell us what they wanted remembered, but what about the voices of the punished themselves? What about the women whose stories were silenced, their words never written down? Those gaps in history leave us with mystery, with fragments that hint at something larger, darker and far more complex. The question lingers in the air: how many punishments have been lost to time, and what do those silences tell us? If we listen closely, we might still hear the echoes of their voices, carried through the centuries, waiting for us to uncover the truth that history tried to bury. And somewhere in those echoes lies the key to understanding why the most bizarre punishments of women from medieval Europe continue to haunt us even now. The square was never just a place for buying bread, grain, or cloth. It was also a stage, and in that stage, the drama of punishment unfolded again and again. Imagine the heavy wooden stocks set in the middle of town, their beams worn smooth by countless hands and necks forced through their openings. To the villagers, these devices were ordinary, like furniture or tools, yet for those trapped inside, every moment stretched into hours of humiliation. Women accused of minor quarrels, gossip, or defiance could find themselves locked there, unable to move while the crowd passed by with smirks, laughter, or scorn. The punishment was not about the body alone. It was about breaking the spirit, reducing someone who had once walked with pride into an object of ridicule. Behind the laughter of onlookers, however, there was always a quiet tension. People watched, yes, but some did so with unease. They knew that punishment in medieval Europe was not only about justice. It was about control. The bizarre punishments of women often revealed just how fragile that control really was. A society afraid of disorder turned to spectacle as a shield. And so, humiliation became a weapon as sharp as any blade. One of the strangest punishments whispered about in records was the use of the ducking stool. To modern ears, the very name might sound almost playful, but for women accused of nagging, scolding, or stirring trouble, it was anything but. The woman would be tied to a chair fixed at the end of a long wooden beam, and then lowered into water, sometimes a pond, sometimes a river. Villagers gathered on the banks, watching as the chair was tipped forward and the woman plunged beneath the surface. Her gasp for air, her struggle to breathe, became the entertainment of the day. And yet, the punishment was framed as a lesson, a way to cleanse the community of troublesome voices. It was bizarre, cruel, and deeply symbolic. Silence enforced not by reason, but by fear. For every punishment like this, there are countless stories of women whose names we will never know. A baker's wife accused of cheating customers. A shepherd's daughter accused of speaking disrespectfully to a priest. A widow blamed for misfortune simply because she lived alone. Their punishments varied, but all carried the same message: conform or be crushed by public shame. These women were not criminals in the way we might imagine today. Their crimes were often nothing more than being different, outspoken, or inconvenient in a world where obedience was valued above individuality. As word of such punishment spread, they took on lives of their own. Travelers would carry the tales from one village to another, adding details, embellishing here and there, until the punishments became legends. A woman silenced by an iron bridal mask. Another paraded through the streets with signs hanging around her neck declaring her crime. Another forced to endure hours of public mockery while tied to a stool in the square. These stories reminded everyone, especially women, that stepping beyond invisible boundaries had consequences far greater than the act itself. Yet beneath these tales of control, something else flickered: resilience. Women endured, adapted, and resisted in ways both quiet and bold. Some mocked the punishments even as they suffered them, meeting the eyes of their accusers with defiance rather than shame. Others whispered their own stories, ensuring their daughters would understand what they had lived through. Some communities, too, began to question the fairness of these practices. Though rare, there were moments when punishments backfired, when sympathy for the punished outweighed loyalty to authority. The crowd, meant to enforce shame, sometimes shifted into murmurs of pity or even outrage. In those moments, the bizarre punishments revealed their own weakness. They could break individuals, but they could not always control the human heart. The church played no small part in shaping these customs. Medieval Europe was steeped in religious authority, where sin was not only a matter of personal guilt, but also a danger to the community. Women, often portrayed in sermons as weak or easily tempted, bore the brunt of these fears. The idea that women needed stronger discipline became a justification for punishments that seemed outlandish, even absurd, yet were treated as righteous. The line between spiritual correction and social control blurred, until they became one and the same. But history is never as simple as it first appears. Within the church itself were debates, contradictions, and disagreements. Some leaders advocated for gentleness, forgiveness, and guidance rather than spectacle and shame. Others doubled down on harshness, believing it was the only way to maintain order. In this clash of views, ordinary women lived out their lives, caught between compassion and cruelty, between voices that defended them and voices that condemned them. If you close your eyes and imagine, you can almost hear the sounds of these punishments. The creak of wood as stocks were closed shut. The splash of water as a ducking stool hit the river. The clang of iron as a bridal mask locked into place. And, perhaps most haunting of all, the murmur of the crowd, sometimes mocking, sometimes pitying, but always watching. For the punished, those sounds lingered long after the punishment ended. They lived on in dreams, in memories, in the way neighbors looked at them afterward. Punishment was never just a moment. It became a shadow that followed them through life. What is most bizarre of all is not only the devices or rituals themselves, but the way entire communities accepted them. Parents brought their children to watch. Priests gave blessings before they began. Merchants paused their trade to gather around. The punishments were woven into the rhythm of life, treated as normal, even necessary. And yet, if we look closely, cracks appear in this picture of acceptance. In private, some must have wondered whether these humiliations truly please God or simply please those in power. The deeper we go into this history, the more it becomes clear that punishment was not just about crime. It was about control, spectacle, and fear. Women stood at the center of this strange system, their bodies and reputations turned into symbols for lessons the powerful wanted to teach. But symbols are never just symbols. They were real people with real pain, real tears, and real strength. And as strange as these punishments seem to us now, they hold a mirror to questions that remain hauntingly familiar. Who decides what behavior is acceptable? Who has the power to punish? And how often is punishment less about justice and more about control? The answers lie hidden in dusty records, in crumbling manuscripts, and in stories that have slipped through the cracks of history. But not all of them. Some stories remain, waiting to be told, waiting to remind us that the bizarre punishments of medieval women are not only relics of the past. They are warnings for the present. The tale is not over. The strangest punishments, the darkest stories, the ones that left even medieval crowds uneasy, are still waiting in the shadows. And once we uncover them, the line between history and nightmare may blur in ways we are not prepared to face. The faint ringing of church bells often signaled more than prayer in medieval towns. For many, it was the sound that called them toward the marketplace where something unusual was about to unfold. The community gathered, children clutching their mothers' hands, men pausing from their trades, elders leaning on their walking sticks. These gatherings were not spontaneous. They were carefully staged. Punishment in medieval Europe was not hidden behind closed doors. It was public, visible, and deliberately designed to leave an impression on every witness. To see a woman punished was to learn a lesson, and that lesson often had less to do with her personal crime and more to do with keeping everyone else in line. Among the most infamous devices was the scold's bridle, also known as the brank. It was an iron mask fitted over the head, sometimes grotesquely decorated with horns or animal-like features, as if to strip the punished woman of her humanity. Inside the mask, a small plate or spike pressed against her tongue, ensuring she could not speak. Women accused of gossip, nagging, or quarreling with neighbors were forced to wear it as they were paraded through streets. Imagine the weight of iron digging into her skull, the chafing of metal on skin, the helplessness of trying to call out only to have her own tongue silenced by steel. But perhaps the cruelest part was not the physical pain. It was the way people stared, laughed, and whispered. The mask did not just silence her voice. It transformed her into a living warning, a spectacle meant to terrify others into silence as well. Equally strange was the cucking stool, which evolved into the infamous ducking stool. On the surface, it resembled a simple chair fixed at the end of a beam, but its purpose was humiliating. Women accused of being scolds, cheats, or disruptive wives were strapped into the chair and then either left in the open for hours or plunged repeatedly into water. The crowd would cheer as the chair tipped forward, the victims' cries swallowed by splashes. To the community, it was entertainment mixed with discipline. To the woman, it was terror disguised as justice. The punishment was framed as cleansing, but what it really cleansed was her dignity, leaving scars invisible to the eye but lasting for a lifetime. Even stranger punishments emerged from the blending of superstition and authority. In some regions, women accused of witchcraft were subjected to ordeals, trials that relied not on evidence, but on bizarre rituals. One common ordeal was the ordeal by water, where a woman's hands and feet were bound before she was cast into a pond or river. If she sank, she was declared innocent, though often drowned in the process. If she floated, she was judged guilty, supposedly buoyed by the devil's hand. Such twisted logic shows just how deeply fear shaped justice. These trials were not fair processes. They were performances, dramatizations of belief and fear, with women trapped in the center. But not all punishments were as elaborate. Sometimes, the cruelty lay in simplicity. Women accused of minor offenses could be forced to carry heavy objects through town, stones, barrels, or even wooden crosses, so everyone would know their shame. Others had to wear unusual garments, such as a hood with bells or a tunic marked with symbols of their supposed crime. These punishments turned daily life into a stage where every step reminded them of their fall from respectability. The worst part was that, once marked, it was almost impossible to escape the memory. Neighbors would not forget, children would point, and whispers would follow long after the punishment ended. What makes these punishments so haunting is the way they reveal the mindset of the age. Medieval Europe believed deeply in community order, in the idea that the behavior of one person could threaten the balance of all. Punishment was not about the individual alone. It was about sending a message to everyone else. And since women were seen as both vital to the household and suspiciously prone to sin, they became frequent targets. Their silence, obedience, and conformity were demanded, and when they resisted or simply failed to meet impossible standards, bizarre punishments were the result. The people watching were not passive. Their reactions mattered. A punishment needed an audience to be effective. Laughter, jeers, or even stones thrown at the punished person reinforced the lesson. Yet sometimes the crowd wavered. Imagine a mother of 3, tied to the stocks for quarreling with her neighbor. At first, the villagers laugh, but as her children cry at her side, the mood changes. Whispers rise. Was this really justice, or cruelty dressed in ceremony? These cracks in the spectacle show us that not everyone accepted the system without question. There are moments of doubt, flashes of compassion, but they were rarely enough to overturn tradition. Behind these punishments, power operated quietly. Local officials, church leaders, and even neighbors could use accusations as tools. A woman who challenged authority or simply stood out could quickly find herself accused of gossip, of stubbornness, of sin. The punishments were not just about correcting behavior. They were about enforcing conformity. They were warnings, reminding every other woman of what might happen if she dared to step outside her expected role. And yet, despite this constant threat, women endured. Some bore their punishments with silent defiance, meeting the eyes of the crowd without lowering their heads. Others turned their humiliation into lessons for their daughters, teaching them how to survive in a world stacked against them. Their strength often went unnoticed in official records, but it existed in the stories whispered through generations. These women remind us that even in the darkest chapters of history, resilience flickers like a candle, refusing to be extinguished. As we peel back the layers of these bizarre punishments, we begin to see them not just as curiosities of the past, but as windows into the fears and power struggles of medieval society. They tell us who held power, who was silenced, and how communities tried to control what they could not fully understand. And yet, the most unsettling part of all is the question left hanging in the air. How many more punishments, stranger and darker than those recorded, have been lost to time? How many stories vanished with the women who lived and died without ever being remembered? The silence of history is sometimes louder than its records. And in that silence lies a mystery we have yet to uncover. As the years passed, the punishments that had once been accepted as ordinary began to stir unease among the people who witnessed them. For every crowd that cheered or jeered, there were also those who left quietly, carrying with them an uncomfortable question. Was this really justice, or just cruelty dressed in tradition? The deeper conflict in medieval Europe was not just about women being punished in bizarre ways, but about the constant tension between fear and fairness, control and compassion. Behind the masks, the stools, and the rituals lay a society struggling to balance survival with morality, authority with humanity. One subplot that threads itself through these punishments is the tension between church and community. The church insisted that sin had to be punished, not just for the sake of the sinner, but for the soul of the entire town. Yet villagers sometimes resisted when punishment touched too close to home. A woman punished for gossip might have been someone's sister, someone's friend, someone who once shared bread with her neighbors. Suddenly, the jeering crowd was not laughing at a stranger, but at one of their own. This is where conflict deepened. The very tools meant to enforce unity sometimes broke it apart, leaving wounds that festered silently long after the punishment was over. Take, for instance, the ducking stool in a small riverside village. One spring morning, a young wife accused of scolding her husband was strapped to the chair. The townspeople gathered, as they always did, expecting a spectacle. But when she was plunged into the cold river, her mother cried out in horror, breaking the silence with a scream that echoed across the water. That cry unsettled the crowd. Some turned their faces away, ashamed to watch. Others whispered that the husband himself had exaggerated the quarrel just to rid himself of embarrassment. In that moment, the punishment no longer seemed like justice. It seemed like revenge. But no one dared to stop it. The fear of questioning authority was as strong as the fear of being punished themselves. Another layer of conflict unfolded within households. Many of these bizarre punishments revolved around women being accused of disrupting the peace at home. A wife accused of nagging, a daughter accused of speaking too boldly, a widow accused of independence. All could face public humiliation. Yet these accusations often masked deeper struggles within families. Sometimes they were born from jealousy, sometimes from disputes over inheritance, sometimes from simple resentment. What appeared in public as a punishment for gossip might have started in private as a feud over land or loyalty. These hidden conflicts show us that the punishments were not only tools of justice, but also weapons in personal wars, turning the machinery of society into a means of settling scores. There were also tensions within the church itself. Some priests and bishops genuinely believed that public shame was the only way to protect the community. Others, however, worried that such punishment strayed too far from mercy and forgiveness. These disagreements did not always spill into the open, but their whispers shaped decisions behind closed doors. In some towns, punishments were carried out with brutal regularity. In others, they were softened, replaced with fines or penance. The unevenness only deepened the mystery. Why did one village drench its women in rivers while another simply demanded prayers? What forces decided the difference? Was it truly faith or the personal will of those who held power at the time? Suspense thickens when we remember that history leaves gaps. The stories that survived are often those written by men in power, clerks, judges, priests. They recorded the punishments, but rarely the voices of the women themselves. What would those women have said if their words had been preserved? Would they have told of humiliation, of despair, of betrayal by neighbors who turned their backs? Or would some have spoken with pride, remembering how they endured with unbroken spirit despite the iron bridle, despite the ducking stool, despite the weight of shame? Their silence is a mystery, a conflict that lingers in the absence of their voices. Meanwhile, in the shadows of official records, another subplot played out: resistance. Though most endured their punishments in silence, there were rare moments when communities pushed back. Stories survive of crowds who turned on the officials, of punishments abandoned midway when sympathy overwhelmed spectacle. In one tale, a woman bound to the stocks was quietly released in the night by her friends, who risked their own safety to spare her further humiliation. These small acts of defiance show us that not everyone accepted the bizarre punishments as right. There were always those who saw them for what they were: tools of fear, not of justice. The conflict also stretched into questions of gender. Men and women did not face the same kinds of punishments. While men might be whipped for theft or fined for fighting, women were targeted for behavior tied to speech, reputation, and morality. This imbalance was not lost on everyone. Some men, especially those with daughters or wives, grew uneasy at the sight of punishments that seemed designed less to correct crimes and more to control women's voices. Still, their unease rarely translated into action. The risk of speaking out was too great. So the silence deepened, even as doubts spread like cracks beneath the surface. Suspense grows when we consider the larger picture. Medieval Europe was a place of constant uncertainty. Plagues sweeping through villages, wars destroying fields, famines leaving bellies empty. In such a fragile world, punishment was one of the few things people could control. To them, it was a way of keeping chaos at bay. Yet the irony is that these bizarre punishments often created new chaos. Families torn apart, communities divided, trust eroded. The very system meant to hold society together carried within it the seeds of conflict that threatened to tear it apart. And still, the story does not end there. The strangest punishments, the ones that seem almost too cruel or too absurd to be real, remain half-hidden in the margins of history. Were they exaggerated by rumor, or did they truly happen as described? Did communities actually believe in their justice, or were they merely too afraid to question them? These questions hang unanswered, leaving the tension unresolved. For every recorded punishment, there may be dozens that vanished with time, locked away in silence. What makes this conflict haunting is that it is not just about the past. It forces us to ask questions about the present as well. Who holds the power to decide what is right or wrong? How often is punishment used not for justice but for control? And when silence becomes the expected response, who dares to speak? The answers remain hidden in the stories we have yet to uncover. And until those stories are told, the mystery of the most bizarre punishments of women in medieval Europe remains a shadow that refuses to fade. The further we journey into the world of medieval Europe, the more we see how punishment was not simply about law and order, but about control, fear, and spectacle. Every village, town, and city seemed to have its own way of reminding people, especially women, of their place. The deeper conflict was not always written in the statutes or carved into the wooden signs of the marketplace. It lived in the invisible tension between authority and the powerless, between those who enforced the rules and those who had no choice but to endure them. This is what makes the history of bizarre punishments so haunting. There were not only public demonstrations of justice, but also warnings, living theater meant to shape behavior through humiliation and fear. One of the conflicts that runs like a shadow through these stories is how communities justified cruelty in the name of order. Many women lived their lives carefully, hoping never to draw unwanted attention, but the smallest misstep, sometimes even a rumor, could place them in the line of fire. The moment their names were whispered in connection to gossip, superstition, or accusations of disobedience, they were caught in a system they could not escape. Punishment became less about fairness and more about maintaining authority, and the individuals who suffered were left voiceless. Yet these silenced voices echo through the centuries, telling us about the injustice they endured. There was another layer of conflict, too, the clash between personal lives and public judgment. Imagine a woman who argued with her husband or who raised her voice in the market. In a world where order was prized above individuality, even such small actions could be exaggerated into evidence of rebellion or wickedness. Once accused, she was not just punished for her behavior, but for challenging an unspoken code, to be silent, obedient, and invisible. This clash created a cycle of fear, where many people began to police themselves, hiding who they truly were to avoid punishment. That fear lingers in the background of every story we uncover. Subplots begin to emerge when we look closely at different punishments and their settings. In one town, the brank or scold's bridle might be placed on a woman accused of speaking out of turn. In another, a ducking stool would wait by the riverbank, where neighbors gathered to watch as women were submerged again and again under icy water. These weren't random choices. They were symbolic punishments tailored to send a message. The brank was about silencing. The ducking stool was about cleansing. Both served as metaphors for society's attempt to reshape women into something smaller, quieter, and more acceptable. But within these grim spectacles, there are other stories. There were neighbors who turned their faces away, pretending not to hear the cries, too afraid to intervene. There were children who watched with wide eyes, learning what happened to those who stepped out of line. And there were moments when punishments backfired, when the cruelty seemed too harsh even for the crowd, and murmurs of sympathy spread quietly among the people. These small cracks in the system remind us that history is never just black and white. Even within strict societies, there are people who questioned whether such punishments truly serve justice. We also cannot ignore the role of power in all of this. Punishments often reflected the interests of those who held authority, lords, clergy, or local councils. For them, maintaining discipline was about preserving their own control. If a woman could be silenced with iron or drowned in a pond, then the community learned quickly not to challenge the authority that ruled over them. These spectacles reinforced hierarchy. The punished were not simply individuals. They became symbols of resistance crushed, voices extinguished. And the system thrived on this, feeding itself through fear. The suspense builds when we think about how unpredictable this world could be. A woman could live her whole life quietly, only to find herself accused one day by a neighbor who bore a grudge. Another could be dragged into punishment not for her own actions, but for being connected to someone else's scandal. The unpredictability of justice created an atmosphere of dread where no one felt truly safe. And this unpredictability is what makes the history so chilling. It leaves us asking, who would be next? Subplots also develop when we consider the contrast between urban and rural life. In cities, punishments could become grand spectacles, drawing crowds from across the districts. In smaller villages, they were intimate and personal, carried out in front of familiar faces, neighbors, and family members. Both settings carried their own horrors. In the city, the crowd was vast and merciless, often jeering as the punishment unfolded. In the village, the humiliation cut deeper because the people watching were those the victim had known all her life. Every punishment carried long echoes, shame that would follow a person long after the iron was removed or the water had dried. But perhaps the deepest conflict was the one inside the people themselves. For those who watched, there must have been moments of hesitation, times when they wondered whether the spectacle was fair. Did guilt flicker in their hearts as they cheered or stood silently? Did they ever imagine themselves in the same position or their loved ones? This quiet, internal conflict may have been the most dangerous of all, because it could plant seeds of doubt that threatened to weaken the authority behind the punishments. Yet, despite these seeds, the cycle continued. Punishments grew stranger, harsher, more theatrical. Communities seemed locked in a competition of cruelty, each generation inventing new ways to enforce silence and obedience. And this is where the suspense sharpens. We begin to see how far people could go in the name of justice, how bizarre and unsettling the punishments could become. Some were cruelly inventive, others almost absurd, yet each carried a dark purpose. As we move deeper into this story, one question rises like a shadow. Were these punishments truly about justice, or were they about something darker? Fear, control, and the silencing of those who dared to be different? The unresolved tension lingers here, in the space between spectacle and silence, between what was visible in the town square and what was hidden in the hearts of the people. The story is far from finished, and the next turn promises to reveal punishments even stranger, conflicts even deeper, and a history that refuses to be forgotten. Every time we step further into the dark maze of medieval punishments, the story grows heavier, yet more fascinating. Each punishment was not just a sentence, but a theater of power, where entire communities became both audience and participants. And those centuries have passed, the strangeness and severity of these practices still raise questions that echo in our minds. The conflict remains alive, not only between rulers and subjects, men and women, but between justice and cruelty itself. As the years rolled on, punishments became almost ritualistic. They were rehearsed spectacles, so deeply woven into the culture that people grew accustomed to them, even as they shuddered. What makes these stories unsettling is not only the bizarre tools or methods, but the way ordinary people accepted them as part of daily life. Mothers led their children past the town square, knowing they might witness a neighbor being strapped into a chair. Merchants paused their trading to watch a punishment unfold. Life and cruelty mixed so seamlessly that it became impossible to separate justice from entertainment. This is where the mystery deepens. Was this truly about law, or about feeding a community's hunger for control, or perhaps even spectacle? We can imagine the lives of the women who found themselves trapped in these performances of shame. Some were accused because they argued too loudly with their husbands. Others because their neighbors claimed they cursed or gossiped too much. Still others were targeted because they simply did not fit the image of the obedient, quiet figure society demanded. These women did not begin their days expecting to become symbols of defiance crushed in public view. They began them like any of us, cooking meals, caring for family, trying to survive another day. Yet by sundown, they could be bound, displayed, and mocked. The conflict here lies in how ordinary moments could transform into extraordinary cruelty with terrifying speed. There is also the question of who benefited from such punishments. While the accused bore the suffering, those in positions of authority, the local lord, the magistrates, the clergy, gained strength. Each punishment reaffirmed their role as keepers of order. It was less about correcting one person's behavior and more about sending a ripple of fear through the crowd. Each scream, each moment of humiliation became a silent agreement between the rulers and the ruled. Step out of line, and this too will be your fate. Subplots form when we think of the small, often invisible rebellions that lived beneath the surface. Not every villager agreed with the cruelty they witnessed. Whispers of pity might pass between two mothers in the crowd, quickly hushed in case the wrong ears overheard. A child might cry at the sight of the punishment, tugging on their father's hand and asking why. Perhaps a neighbor quietly slipped food or comfort to the punished woman afterward, though such an act of compassion risked drawing suspicion. These quiet acts of humanity, though small, remind us that even in the harshest times, people struggled with their conscience. And yet, they rarely had the power to change the system. The structure of fear was too strong. Suspense builds as we notice how punishments became stranger with time. It wasn't enough to silence someone with words or warnings. Authorities crafted punishments that were symbolic, each tied to the supposed offense. A woman accused of being too talkative was forced into silence with an iron brake. A woman accused of dishonesty might be paraded with signs branding her reputation forever. A woman thought to be disobedient could find herself strapped into the ducking stool, lowered again and again into freezing water until her spirit broke, or worse. These bizarre rituals weren't random. They were designed to wound not only the body, but the identity, the dignity, the very soul of the punished. The most haunting part of all this is how communities often gathered to watch. People jeered, laughed, pointed. Children clapped, not understanding the gravity of what they were seeing. It was not just a punishment, it was a spectacle, one that blurred the line between justice and cruelty. The conflict in this spectacle is chilling. Where did justice end, and where did entertainment begin? How could the very same people who prayed in church on Sunday cheer as their neighbor was humiliated on Monday? But within these contradictions lies the power of the story. Each punishment reveals not just a bizarre method, but the anxieties of society always on edge. Medieval Europe was a world shaped by famine, disease, superstition, and constant fear of disorder. When people felt powerless against forces like plague or war, they found false control in punishing those within reach. And women, often placed at the bottom of this hierarchy, became easy targets. Their voices were silenced, their reputations shattered, their lives altered forever, all in the name of maintaining balance. We must also pause to consider how memory worked in these communities. A punishment was not just for the moment. It lived on in whispers, in rumors, in reputations passed down like shadows. A woman humiliated once might never truly recover, her family marked, her children looked at with suspicion. The punishment lingered long after the iron was removed, embedding itself into the collective memory of the town. This lingering shame may have been the most bizarre punishment of all, not something crafted by iron or wood, but by the weight of memory itself. And yet, the mystery only grows darker when we think of how these practices spread across Europe. They were not isolated incidents of cruelty. They were part of a culture that believed punishment must be seen, that discipline must be performed, that authority must be public. From England to Germany, from France to Italy, we find echoes of the same punishments, the same fear, the same bizarre theater of humiliation. What drove such widespread cruelty? Was it truly about keeping order, or was it a reflection of deeper fears? Fears of rebellion, fears of women's voices, fears of a society slipping into chaos? As we linger here, we find ourselves at the edge of something even more unsettling. The punishments we've explored are only the beginning. The further we look, the stranger they become, and the more their cruelty takes on a symbolic weight. Each story reveals not just what was done, but why, and the why is far more disturbing. Behind every prank, every ducking stool, every ritual of shame lies a story of fear, power, and resistance, tangled together in ways that refuse to be easily untangled. The suspense remains sharp, because for every punishment we uncover, new questions rise, questions that history has never fully answered. The air in medieval towns always carried a quiet tension, as though people knew that on any given day, a life could change forever. That tension thickened whenever word spread that someone, often a woman, was to be punished in the square. Families closed their doors, children whispered to each other, merchants left their stalls, and soon the entire community moved toward the spectacle. It was not only about the punishment itself, but about the fear it planted in every soul that gathered. This was the stage where power declared itself, and no one could look away. The suspense of what was to come always held the crowd in an uneasy grip. By now, the punishments had taken on lives of their own. They were no longer mere tools of justice, but symbols of an invisible war, authority against defiance, silence against voice, obedience against resistance. Each punishment carried the weight of centuries of fear, and as the punishments grew more bizarre, the tension in society grew sharper. People could not know who would be next, and that unpredictability was itself a weapon. The most ordinary mistake, a sharp word spoken too loudly, a quarrel overheard, a rumor spread, could set the stage for humiliation that would mark a family for generations. Picture the moment when the brank, the heavy iron mask with its cruel tongue piece, was brought out. The mere sight of it made hearts sink. Women who spoke too freely or who dared to challenge authority dreaded its shadow. In that instant, silence was no longer a choice. It was forced upon them with cold iron. The crowd leaned forward, waiting to see how long she could endure, waiting to hear if the metal would cut into her tongue as she tried to speak. The suspense was not only in the suffering, but in the question of whether anyone would dare to intervene. And almost always, no one did. Then there was the ducking stool, set near the murky water of a pond or river. When a chair was dragged into place, villagers would gather in hushed tones, the water rippling like a mirror of dread. A woman accused of gossip, quarrels, or worse would be strapped in, her cries echoing across the water. As the stool was lowered, the surface swallowed her whole, bubbles rising like desperate breaths. The crowd waited in silence, wondering if she would resurface with her spirit broken, or if she would not resurface at all. The tension here was unbearable, for it was not only about survival, but about how much cruelty the community was willing to witness without flinching. But the climax of this strange world of punishments was not in the iron or the water alone. It was in the way these acts forced entire communities into complicity. A neighbor's betrayal could spark it. A whispered accusation could fuel it. And once the process began, there was no turning back. Everyone became part of the performance. The authorities who ordered it, the guards who enforced it, the families who watched in fear, and the punished who bore the weight of all eyes upon them. Each punishment was a mirror reflecting society's darkest instincts, and the suspense grew unbearable because, deep down, everyone feared they might one day be in that mirror. The most bizarre punishments often revealed themselves at moments of great unrest, when fear gripped people more tightly than reason. In times of plague, famine, or political struggle, punishments became harsher, as if by punishing one, the community could calm its collective anxiety. But instead of calming it, these acts only sharpened the sense of dread. Each act of cruelty left behind scars, on the punished, on the watchers, on the very soul of the community. And the question that hung in the air was this: how far would they go? We can imagine one such night, when torches flickered against the walls of a medieval square and the crowd pressed in close. A woman was led forward, her hands bound, her face pale in the firelight. The authorities announced her crime. Perhaps it was gossip, perhaps disobedience, perhaps something as simple as refusing to bow to an order. The punishment waiting for her was not yet revealed, and that unknown hung heavy in the air. Would it be the brank, the ducking stool, or something even stranger, something whispered about but rarely seen? The suspense of the moment made every heartbeat louder, every breath sharper. It is here, at the edge of this unknown, that the story builds to its peak. The woman's eyes meet those of the crowd, searching for sympathy, but finding only silence. The officials prepare the punishment, their movements deliberate, their faces unreadable. The crowd shifts, some eager, some uneasy, all waiting. The torches crackle, the night grows colder, and the stage is set. The conflict between justice and cruelty, between silence and voice, between fear and resistance, has reached its most intense point. What happens next will not only decide her fate, but will echo across the lives of all who stand watching. And yet, just as the punishment is about to unfold, we stop. The moment holds, unresolved, like a breath caught in the throat. The suspense is at its highest, the tension unbearable. The story of bizarre punishments has brought us here, to the edge of a decision, to the brink of cruelty, to the climax of fear and spectacle. But the resolution remains hidden, waiting in the shadows of history, waiting in the next part of the story. The night was still, but in that stillness the weight of expectation pressed down harder than any sound. The square was full, torches burning against the chill air, their smoke curling upward like a warning to the heavens. Everyone had gathered, yet no one spoke above a whisper. The woman stood in the center, bound and trembling, though whether from fear or defiance, no one could quite tell. That uncertainty, that question of how she would endure, added a layer of suspense to the already suffocating atmosphere. Every eye was fixed on her, but every heart beat fast with the thought that tomorrow it could be someone else. The officials moved with ritual-like precision. First came the announcement of her crime. The words echoed off the stone walls, repeated with enough force to be heard even in the furthest corners of the square. Disobedience, they declared. Defiance. Simple words, yet heavy enough to seal her fate. The crowd shifted uneasily, murmurs rippling through them. Some nodded, agreeing silently with the charge. Others glanced nervously at each other, wondering whether the punishment would be too much. Yet none spoke out, for silence was its own form of survival. At the edge of the square, a wooden structure creaked as it was dragged forward. The ducking stool, its frame damp from past punishments, was pulled into place beside the dark pool of water. A hush fell over the crowd as they recognized it, the torchlight reflecting on the rippling surface. The sight alone was enough to make stomachs twist. For many, it was not the first time they had seen it used, and the memory of screams and splashing water returned with brutal clarity. The stool was not merely an object of wood and iron. It was a symbol of humiliation, of helplessness, of being broken in full view of one's neighbors. The woman's eyes widened as she understood what was to come. She tried to speak, but her words were drowned out by the guard's commands. Her voice, though faint, carried fragments of desperation, pleas of innocence, cries for mercy. Yet the brink of silence already hung heavy in the minds of the people. They had seen too many punished before to believe her words could change her fate. The guards fastened her in place, tightening the straps with mechanical precision. Every buckle clicked like a nail hammered into her freedom. The stool creaked as it was swung toward the water. The crowd leaned forward, some clutching their cloaks tighter, others covering their children's eyes. The tension was unbearable, not just because of the act itself, but because of the unspoken fear it carried. Each person wondered, if this was justice for her, what small act could bring it upon them? The stool lowered, the water rippled, and then, with a splash that echoed like thunder, she was submerged. For a moment, the surface went still. Only the bubbles rising to the top gave away the struggle beneath. The crowd held its breath, waiting, counting in silence, their eyes fixed on the water. Seconds stretched into an eternity. Would she resurface? Would her cries return? Or would the water swallow her whole? The guards yanked the stool back up, and she emerged gasping, choking, her hair plastered to her face, her cries turning into coughs. But before she could catch her breath, the stool was lowered again. Each plunge became a cruel rhythm, each gasp of air a fleeting chance at life. And yet, the crowd could not look away. Some faces were cold, watching without expression. Others showed unease, eyes flickering with pity they dared not express aloud. A few whispered prayers, though no one knew if they were for her or for themselves. The punishment was not only hers. It was shared by everyone who bore witness, a reminder etched into their memory of what happened when order was challenged. But as the water splashed again and again, something strange happened. The murmurs grew louder. Not all were comfortable with what they saw. Whispers of enough passed between a few in the crowd, though always in hushed tones. Others glanced at the officials, wondering how long this would continue. For the first time, tension began to shift, not only toward the woman suffering, but toward the system itself. It was a dangerous thought, one no one dared to voice aloud, but it hung heavy in the night air. Was this punishment truly justice, or was it cruelty dressed in law? The stool lifted once more, the woman's sobs filling the silence between the crowd's murmurs. She was weak now, her body limp, her spirit battered. The guards exchanged glances, uncertain whether to continue or to stop. The officials, stern and unyielding, motioned for one more plunge. The crowd gasped, some turning away, others staring harder, unable to decide whether to resist or to accept what they saw. It was in this moment that the tension reached its highest point, not because of the act itself, but because of the growing divide between those who accepted the punishment and those who questioned it. The stool swung again, hovering over the dark water. The torches flickered, their flames casting uneasy shadows across the square. The woman closed her eyes, as if preparing for the end. The crowd braced, waiting for the inevitable splash. Every sound seemed magnified. The creak of the wood, the rustle of the guards' boots, the wind cutting through the silence. The entire square seemed to hold its breath, caught in a single moment, suspended between justice and cruelty, between silence and defiance, between the past and a future yet to be written. And then, nothing. The stool hung in the air, frozen by hesitation. The crowd leaned forward, the suspense unbearable. Would it plunge again? Would the officials relent? Would someone, anyone, dare to speak against what was unfolding? The air itself seemed to tremble with anticipation. This was no longer just a punishment. It was a question hanging over an entire community, a question no one dared answer yet. The woman's life, the crowd's conscience, the official's authority, all balanced on the edge of that final moment. And just as the decision seemed ready to fall, the knights swallowed the answer in silence, leaving the story unresolved, the tension unbearable, and the questions echoing louder than ever. The stool still hovered over the dark water, swaying gently, the woman strapped in place, her soaked dress clinging to her trembling body. The guard's hands tightened around the ropes, waiting for the order to drop her again. The crowd was silent now, as though the entire town had lost its voice. Torches hissed as the wind swept through the square, shadows dancing across stone walls. The silence was so sharp it seemed to cut, a silence filled not with peace, but with suffocating suspense. No one dared move, no one dared speak. Every heartbeat felt like it could break the moment apart. This was the climax of fear, a single decision that could tip everything. The officials stood stiff, unreadable in the torchlight. They had the power to give the signal, to end the punishment or to push it further. Their eyes scanned the crowd, searching for loyalty in the silence, for confirmation that the people were still under control. Yet what they found instead were faces not so easily read. Some looked away, unable to witness more. Others stared back, their expressions unreadable, but with something flickering beneath: doubt, unease, perhaps even defiance. It was dangerous for such feelings to surface, even in silence. Yet there they were, stirring like a whisper of rebellion. The woman, her head hanging low, gave a weak cry that barely carried through the air. It was not the sharp defiance of someone who refused to break, nor the hollow scream of someone crushed entirely. It was something in between, a voice that lingered in the space between survival and surrender. And that sound, faint though it was, struck something deep in those who heard it. Because in that sound was every fear, every injustice, every unspoken question about the system they all lived under. The stool creaked, swaying slightly as though uncertain of its next move. The suspense became unbearable. Would the officials signal for her to be plunged again, pushing her past the limits of her strength? Would the crowd remain silent, complicit in yet another display of cruelty? Or would someone, anyone, finally break the silence? That was the danger. The story was no longer about her alone. It had become a test of the crowd, a test of the system itself. Around the edges of the square, people shifted nervously. Parents pulled their children closer, shielding their eyes. Merchants, who had come to watch out of fear or curiosity, now clutched their cloaks tighter. Even the guards, hands gripping the ropes, exchanged fleeting glances. The hesitation in their eyes betrayed an unspoken thought. Had this gone too far? But hesitation was dangerous. Hesitation was itself an act of resistance, however small. The officials raised a hand, the signal everyone waited for. The crowd froze. Torches flickered, their light catching on the iron buckles of the stool. This was the moment, whether the woman would be plunged again, whether the crowd would allow it, whether the fragile balance of power would hold. Suspense pressed down so heavily that it seemed the air itself would shatter. And yet, just as the hand lifted, a sound broke the silence. It wasn't a cry from the punished woman. It wasn't the creak of wood or the splash of water. It was a murmur, low, almost lost, but it spread like fire through dry grass. Someone in the crowd had spoken. No one could tell what had been said, but the ripple it caused was undeniable. Heads turned, whispers grew, and for the first time, the silence of obedience cracked. The officials faltered for the briefest moment, their raised hand trembling before steadying again. They scanned the crowd, eyes narrowed, searching for the source of the murmur. But by then, it no longer mattered who had spoken. The sound had already broken the spell. The crowd, once united in fearful silence, was now a restless sea of murmurs, shifting feet, uneasy glances. The power of the spectacle was slipping, not yet gone, but teetering. And that teetering made the suspense almost unbearable. The guards hesitated, their ropes taut, waiting for the order they no longer fully believed in. The woman's weak breaths filled the gap, her eyes half closed, as if she too felt the shift in the air. She was not free, not safe, not spared, but something was changing around her. Something fragile, dangerous, uncertain. The torches hissed louder, the shadows grew longer, the crowd leaned in. The moment stretched like a bowstring pulled too tight, threatening to snap at any second. Would the officials enforce their authority with another plunge, crushing all murmurs into silence again? Or would hesitation grow, spreading like a fracture through stone, threatening to break the very structure of fear that held the town together? The stool hung there, caught between two fates, swaying over the water as if the whole world held its breath. The punished woman's fate, the crowd's loyalty, the officials' control, all balanced on the edge of a decision yet to be made. And it was in that fragile balance that the true suspense of the story lived. The night did not release the answer. The torches kept burning, the ropes stayed taut, the crowd waited, and the woman gasped faintly in the cold air. Everything hung unresolved, suspended like the stool itself, leaving the tension sharper than ever. History offers us no easy answers here, only the unbearable suspense of a moment where justice, cruelty, silence, and rebellion collided, and the outcome remained hidden in the shadows. The torches hissed in the damp air, their smoke curling like restless spirits above the crowd. The guards still held the ropes tight, but their grip no longer looked like certainty, it looked like strain. Every flicker of hesitation traveled through their arms into the cords, into the stool, and into the body of the woman struggling to breathe. Her shallow gasps echoed like accusations no one dared voice aloud. Each moment of delay stretched unbearably long, as though time itself had slowed down to watch the standoff. The officials exchanged sharp glances, their lips pressed thin, their eyes cold. They had expected silence, submission, the usual nods of obedience. Instead, they were staring into a sea of uncertainty. The lone man who had spoken still stood there, his shoulders squared, his eyes unyielding. He hadn't moved since his first words, but his stillness was louder than any shout. The woman who had added her voice now clutched her shawl tighter, but she didn't back down either. These two had cracked the silence, and the crowd would never forget it. In that silence, a boy's voice broke through. High, trembling but piercing, he shouted something simple, almost childlike, but devastatingly honest. "Why are you hurting her?" The words fell into the crowd like a stone into water. No accusation, no argument, just a question. The kind of question that could unravel everything, because no one had an answer they could say aloud. The officials barked at the boy's family, demanding silence, but their voices now carried less weight. Each attempt to assert control sounded more desperate. They called for order, but their order had already cracked. They threatened punishment, but the crowd wasn't sure they had the strength to carry it out. Every voice raised in doubt made their authority look thinner, their certainty weaker. The guard's hands trembled. One of them, older, his beard streaked with gray, looked down at the woman dangling above the water and then back at the crowd. His jaw clenched. He knew the weight of his actions, and for the first time, he wasn't sure he could obey. The other guard glanced at him nervously, caught between duty and fear, between his training and his conscience. That flicker of humanity, barely visible in their eyes, was enough to make the crowd's murmurs swell louder. The punished woman lifted her head again, her wet hair clinging to her face. She looked not at her judges, but at the crowd, as if silently pleading, or perhaps silently accusing. She didn't need to speak. Her suffering was already speaking louder than words. The spectators felt it in their chests, a pull between complicity and courage. For generations, silence had been the safer choice. But tonight, safety was eroding. The officials raised their hand again, this time in anger rather than ritual. The signal to finish it, to end the uncertainty with force. But just as their hand fell, another figure stepped forward from the edge of the crowd. This time it wasn't a townsman or a mother. It was one of the scribes, a man who usually sat quietly by the official's side, recording every sentence, every punishment. His job was never to question, only to write. Yet now, with his ink-stained hands trembling, he spoke. His words were not defiant. They were cautious, measured, but dangerous all the same. He reminded the officials, in front of everyone, that records lived longer than power. That what happened tonight would not vanish. It would be remembered, written, carried forward. His voice was shaky, but the truth in it was undeniable. Punishments could silence individuals, but history had a way of keeping score. The officials' faces tightened, their fury barely masked. They tried to dismiss him, but the crowd had heard enough. The spell of fear that had always kept them silent was unraveling thread by thread. They weren't rioting, not yet, but they were watching, questioning, shifting in ways that could not be undone. The guards looked to each other again. The older one loosened his grip just slightly, almost imperceptibly, but enough to make the stool sway. Gasps filled the air. Was he weakening? Was he defying? Or was it only hesitation? No one knew, but everyone felt the danger now, the sense that one more push, one more spark, could set the entire square alight. The punished woman's breath rattled in her throat, her chest heaving as she fought for air. Every sound she made carried into the night, haunting and raw. The people nearest to her could no longer look away. A mother pulled her child closer, whispering something soft and protective. An old man shook his head slowly, muttering that the world had lost its balance. The lone man who had first spoken clenched his fists, his face drawn tight with urgency. The square had become a battlefield without swords. It was no longer about the woman alone, but about who held the right to decide her fate, the officials or the collective conscience of the people. Each second stretched taut, like a rope pulled to its breaking point. Then came the most chilling twist yet. From the back of the crowd, a horn blew. Not loud, not triumphant, but sharp and deliberate. The sound cut through every voice, every breath. It wasn't the town's usual signal. It was unfamiliar, jarring. The officials froze. The guards flinched. The crowd turned toward the sound, searching for its source. But in the swirl of torchlight and shadows, no one could see clearly who had blown it. The horn changed everything. The officials seized on it, claiming it as their sign of authority, their right to act. They shouted that the town had already decided, that the signal meant the punishment must go on. But the crowd wasn't sure. The ambiguity deepened the chaos, fueling suspicion. Had the horn come from the officials themselves? From some hidden ally? Or from someone else entirely? The punished woman's eyes widened at the sound, as though she recognized something in it that others didn't. Her chest heaved harder, not just from drowning air, but from something deeper, fear or memory. For a moment, she seemed less like a victim and more like the keeper of a secret no one yet understood. The guards' grip tightened again, but their faces betrayed their conflict. The crowd's murmur turned restless, sharp, like the rumble of a storm about to break. The lone man took a step closer, his eyes locked on the officials. The woman in the shawl clutched her child tighter but lifted her chin, refusing to look away. The scribe, trembling, clutched his quill as though it were a weapon. And all the while, the punished woman's shallow breaths echoed against the stone walls of the square, reminding everyone that this was no longer about tradition or ritual. It was about life and death, about truth and control, about the moment a society decides whether to stay silent or to change. The horn had blown. The crowd had stirred. The guards had faltered. The officials had lost their calm. And yet, no one knew what would come next. The tension pressed down on the square like a storm waiting to break, every torch flickering as if bracing for wind. Would the officials succeed in forcing silence again, crushing doubt beneath the weight of authority? Or had the first cracks grown too wide to mend, with the crowd on the verge of shifting from whispers to shouts? The stool swayed, the ropes strained, the torches hissed, and the night held its breath, waiting for the next move. The horn's echo lingered in the night air, rattling off the stone walls of the square like a phantom that refused to leave. Every pair of eyes darted toward the shadows, but no one could say where the sound had come from. The uncertainty only deepened the unease. The officials seized on it instantly, their voices booming, insisting it was the call of authority, a signal that justice must be carried out without hesitation. Yet the crowd wasn't convinced. Their faces, illuminated by flickering torchlight, told another story: suspicion, doubt, and a gnawing sense that something larger was at play. The punished woman lifted her head weakly, water dripping from her tangled hair. For a fleeting moment, her eyes seemed to burn with recognition. She knew that sound. It wasn't just a horn, it was a mark, a message from somewhere beyond the square. The gasp that left her lips was not only for breath, but for memory. The crowd, seeing her reaction, shifted uncomfortably. They had come expecting a punishment, a grim but familiar ritual. What they found instead was a mystery tightening around them like a noose. The guards still held the ropes, but their arms trembled. The older guard's jaw was set, his knuckles white, while the younger's eyes darted nervously between the officials and the restless crowd. One small mistake, one misstep, and the fragile balance would collapse into chaos. From the crowd's center, the lone man who had first spoken took another deliberate step forward. His presence cut through the air like a blade. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. His silence, his nearness, his steady gaze at the officials carried more weight than any argument. Each step he took was like a challenge, a reminder that their authority depended on the crowd's acceptance, and that acceptance was slipping through their fingers. The officials barked at the guards to end it, to silence all doubt with one decisive act. But then another twist came. A voice rang out from the side of the square, not a villager this time, but a cloaked figure who had been watching quietly until now. The figure's voice was calm, low, but its authority was undeniable. They questioned the officials directly, reminding them of promises once made to the people, of justice sworn to be fair, not cruel. The words struck like iron against stone. The crowd erupted in whispers, recognizing the cloaked figure now. It was someone tied to the council itself, a shadow within their ranks. Their intervention turned the punishment into a trial, not of the accused woman, but of the officials themselves. Authority was cracking from the inside. The officials' fury burned hotter. They threatened the cloaked figure, accused them of betrayal, but their voices carried less conviction with each word. The guards exchanged another look, sweat glistening on their brows. The punishment they were supposed to enforce had transformed into something monstrous, no longer a simple duty, but a choice that could decide the fate of the entire town. The punished woman's shallow breathing grew louder in the stillness, each gasp echoing like a drumbeat. She was the center of it all, yet she was no longer just a victim. Her suffering had become the spark, the mirror reflecting everything wrong in the square. She was frail, yet she held the power to bring down walls of silence built over generations. The boy who had spoken earlier tugged at his mother's sleeve, whispering questions too innocent to be ignored. The mother hushed him, but her own eyes betrayed a question she dared not speak aloud. Around them, men clenched their fists, women held their children tighter, elders muttered prayers under their breath. Every soul in that square felt the weight of the decision hanging above them. The officials raised their hand again, louder this time, their anger masked as resolve. But their voices cracked in the torchlight. They no longer looked like leaders. They looked like men clinging to control. And the crowd saw it. Once a crowd sees fear in its rulers, the spell of authority begins to dissolve. The horn's echo still lingered in memory, unsettling and unresolved. Who had blown it? Why? The question pulsed in every mind. Some whispered it was a secret ally of the punished woman. Others thought it a trick by the officials themselves to mask their weakness. A few muttered darker theories, that it was a warning from forces beyond the town, a sign that this punishment was not theirs to give. The punished woman stirred, her lips parting. She tried to speak, but no clear words came, only a hoarse rasp lost in the wind. Yet even that sound carried weight. It was the voice of someone who had survived the unthinkable, someone whose silence had been forced but not yet broken. The crowd leaned in, straining to hear what truth she might reveal. The younger guard suddenly stepped back, his ropes slackening. The stool rocked, nearly toppling. Gasps erupted, the crowd surging forward a step before pulling back. The older guard cursed under his breath, yanking the rope tighter again, his face torn between loyalty and conscience. That split second of near release electrified the square. The people had seen it. They had seen hesitation take form, and once seen, it could not be unseen. The cloaked figure's voice rose again, firm this time, commanding. They declared that enough blood and shame had stained the town, that continuing would stain it beyond repair. Their words cut deep, not only because of their position, but because the truth was undeniable. Everyone had felt it, but no one had dared speak it until now. The officials shouted back, voices hoarse, but their words clattered like dull steel. Their authority was slipping, their control unraveling strand by strand. The crowd no longer stood as quiet witnesses. They leaned forward, murmurs rising, breaths held, waiting for the moment when hesitation would break into action. And above it all, the punished woman swayed between life and death, her body the battlefield of power, her silence heavier than any cry. The stool rocked, the ropes strained, the torches sputtered, and the horn's ghostly call still haunted the night. The square was on the edge of eruption. One more moment of doubt, one more voice of defiance, one more faltering step from the guards, and everything would change. The punishment was no longer a sentence. It was the spark of something far greater, something none of them had foreseen when they first gathered beneath the cold medieval sky. The crowd held its breath, the officials raised their hand, the guards gripped the ropes, and the punished woman's faint rasp carried through the air, just as the horn sounded again. This time louder, this time closer. The second horn blast tore through the square, louder, sharper, and closer than before. The sound was undeniable now. No echo, no trick. It came from within the town itself, not the hills or the forest beyond. The crowd surged, people twisting to see who held the source of that eerie call. Torches wavered as shoulders bumped, and whispers turned to frantic questions. The punished woman flinched at the sound, her eyes wide with something more than fear. It was recognition, almost terror, as if she knew exactly what the horn meant. The officials faltered for the first time. Their raised hand hung in the air, stiff but uncertain. The first horn had been dismissed as a sign of authority, but the second shattered that illusion. The sound no longer served their power. It mocked it. The guards' ropes slackened slightly, and the stool creaked as the woman gasped again, desperate for air. The younger guard's lips trembled. The older one clenched his teeth, sweat dripping down his face. They could no longer hide their doubt. Then, from the crowd, movement. A group of cloaked figures stepped forward, carrying not weapons but lanterns. Their faces were obscured by shadows, but their voices rang clear, echoing like the horn. They were not villagers, not officials. They belonged to a secret order long whispered about in the town's taverns and hush corners. The Watchers of the Covenant, a group sworn to record and challenge unjust punishments carried out under the guise of law. Few had believed they still existed, yet here they were, stepping into the torchlight. The officials shouted for them to be seized, but the guards did not move. Their loyalty was gone, pulled away by the weight of the crowd and the sudden presence of these watchers. The villagers gasped, realizing the horn was theirs, a symbol meant to signal intervention when injustice reached its peak. The punishment was no longer the town's to finish. It had been claimed by a power older, perhaps deeper, than the council's authority. The cloaked leader raised his lantern high, casting light directly on the punished woman. His voice carried, calm but unyielding. He declared that her punishment was unlawful, that she had been chosen not for guilt but for the council's need to maintain control. He named past victims, drawing threads of memory into a tapestry of truth. With each name, the crowd murmured louder, remembering. These were not faceless punishments anymore. They were neighbors, kin, friends. The punished woman, still gasping, began to cry softly, not from weakness, but from hearing the names of others who had suffered as she had. Her tears mingled with the water on her face, glistening in the lantern light. For the first time, her story was not being buried. It was being spoken aloud for all to hear. The officials tried to regain control, their voices breaking with rage. They accused the watchers of treachery, of defiling order, of stirring rebellion. But their words fell flat. The crowd's eyes were no longer on them. The spell had broken. The people who once bowed their heads now stood taller, their silence transformed into a low, steady hum of agreement. The punishment had failed to silence. It had sparked memory and defiance. The older guard dropped his rope. The stool steadied. The woman collapsed forward, coughing violently as air rushed into her lungs. The younger guard followed, letting his rope fall limp. The crowd gasped in relief, some even weeping, as she lay trembling but alive. The climax had come, not with her death, but with her survival. What was meant to be a display of fear had turned into a moment of courage shared by the people themselves. The officials, pale and shaking, realized their control was slipping through their fingers. Their authority, once absolute, was now questioned openly, fatally. Yet just as relief began to settle, the final twist arrived. The punished woman, still on her knees, lifted her head. Her voice, raspy but steady, broke through the crowd. She revealed something no one expected. She had known the watchers would come. The horn was not a signal of chance, but a promise whispered to her in the days before her punishment. She had been chosen not only as a victim, but as a test, to see if the town would awaken, to see if the people would stand. The crowd froze. The realization struck deep. This was no accident. Her ordeal had been a turning point designed to reveal truth. She had carried the weight of more than her own life. She had carried the weight of the town's silence. And now, as she breathed raggedly in the torchlight, she was proof that silence could be broken. The officials stumbled back, their power shattered by both the watchers and the crowd's awakening. The guards refused to move. The people stood firm. The square had transformed from a place of fear into a place of reckoning. But the twist left the crowd uneasy. If this had been orchestrated, if her suffering had been part of a larger plan, what else remained hidden? What other secrets lingered in the shadows, waiting to be revealed by another horn, another test, another night of reckoning? The punished woman's survival was victory, but her revelation left the air heavy, unsettled. The punishment had ended, the conflict resolved, but the story was far from over. The watchers had stepped into the light, and with them came a new question. What truths still waited in the darkness of medieval Europe? Truths that could shatter everything they thought they knew about justice, power, and silence? The crowd dispersed slowly, whispers filling the night. The stool lay abandoned, the ropes limp, the torches burning low. But the memory of the horn lingered in every heart, a reminder that one day it might sound again. And when it did, no one knew whose story it would bring to light. The crowd that had once gathered in fear and judgment now stood in silence, the weight of centuries hanging heavy in the air. What had started as a simple story about bizarre punishments of women in medieval Europe had unfolded into something far deeper, a reflection of how people, across time and place, chose to treat one another when fear, control, and power dictated the rules. The climax had left behind echoes of suffering, but also traces of resilience, and now the tale began to settle into its final shape, offering answers to questions that had lingered in the shadows. The truth was that the bizarre punishments weren't just about enforcing law or morality. They were about control. Women, who were often blamed for misfortune, accused of witchcraft, or punished for defying societal roles, had become the easiest targets. Each strange punishment, from the cucking stool to the scold's bridle, told the story of a society afraid of losing order. Behind every sentence handed down in those dark courts was not just an individual being punished, but an entire culture trying to silence voices it could not understand. It was never just about one woman on trial. It was about the fear that her independence or defiance might inspire others. Yet even in the cruelest chapters of this history, one cannot ignore the quiet strength of those who endured. Many who faced public shame found ways to preserve their dignity. Some passed their stories on to their children in whispered warnings, ensuring that memory itself became an act of defiance. Others, though silenced in their time, inspired later generations who read about their suffering and began to ask difficult questions. These punishments, bizarre as they were, left behind lessons that could not be erased. The subplot of the traveling historian who pieced together these stories also reached its conclusion. He had set out to document forgotten punishments of medieval Europe, but what he uncovered was more than relics of cruelty. It was a human struggle that echoed across centuries. As he read through court transcripts and diaries, he noticed the same patterns again and again. Communities desperate to find someone to blame, leaders determined to hold power, and women who bore the weight of both. The historian realized he was not just telling a story about the past. He was holding up a mirror to the present. The second twist that had emerged, the revelation that some punishments were exaggerated or mythologized over time, added another layer to the resolution. History, after all, is often shaped not only by what happened, but by what people chose to remember. Some punishments were indeed recorded with precision, while others were passed down through rumor, evolving with each retelling. The lines between fact and myth blurred, reminding the audience that history is not just about truth, but also about interpretation. And in those interpretations, people revealed their deepest fears and desires. The larger conflict, the tension between power and vulnerability, between justice and cruelty, finally found its resolution in the recognition that punishment tells us more about the punisher than the punished. Medieval Europe's strange methods of discipline revealed how fragile its societies felt. When floods destroyed crops, when disease spread without cure, or when wars left kingdoms in ruins, leaders often redirected the blame toward women whose voices seemed easier to silence than confronting the real causes. The punishments were not bizarre for their own sake. They were desperate acts of control in desperate times. But the final twist, subtle yet powerful, came in the realization that many of these punishments sparked reforms centuries later. Outrage grew over time, and as printing presses spread knowledge, voices began to question the justice of such practices. What was once considered normal gradually became shocking, and what had been accepted as order slowly came to be seen as cruelty. That shift revealed that human progress is built on remembering, not forgetting, the mistakes of the past. The very stories of these women, preserved through pain, became seeds of change for the generations that followed. As the story reached its closing moments, the camera of imagination pulled back from the medieval courts and punishments to the broader sweep of human history. The bizarre punishments of women were not simply isolated tales of the past. They were warnings. They reminded us of how fear can lead to cruelty, how silence can enable injustice, and how fragile human dignity can be if it is not protected. The audience, having traveled through centuries of strange and unsettling justice, now found themselves holding a mirror up to their own time. The reflections left behind were clear. The measure of any society lies not in how it treats the powerful, but in how it treats the vulnerable. Punishments may no longer look like they did in medieval squares, but the impulse to shame, control, or silence still exists in different forms. The question, then, was whether we had truly learned from history or whether we still carried echoes of those bizarre practices in modern ways. The resolution tied together the human stories that have been woven throughout. The woman in the village square who faced the scold's bridle, the mother who endured exile for defying marriage laws, the young girl branded with shame for accusations she could never disprove. all of them became symbols, not of defeat, but of endurance. Their voices, though suppressed in their own time, now spoke louder than the authorities who once judged them. Their legacy was not their punishment, but their survival, and through that survival came lessons we cannot afford to ignore. As the tale ended, it did not leave the audience in despair, but in reflection. History had revealed its cruelty, yes, but also its ability to change. From bizarre punishments born of fear came progress born of memory. From silence came voices that carried across centuries. The story, which had begun with shock and mystery, closed with a quiet but powerful truth. Humanity is shaped by its darkest moments, but it is also defined by how it chooses to rise above them. The final words left the audience with a haunting image of a medieval square now empty, the wooden stocks and iron bridles abandoned, gathering dust under the weight of time. The punishments were gone, but the questions remained. What do we carry forward from this history? And how do we ensure that cruelty disguised as justice never finds its way back into our lives? And with that lingering thought, the story closed in a natural, human way, reminding all who listened that the most bizarre punishments of women from medieval Europe were more than tales of the past. They were lessons, warnings, and echoes, urging us to look closer at the world we live in today and the justice we choose to shape for tomorrow.